So this next section, these next three readings, are about what do we owe to one another? What are our moral obligations in how we treat other people, and especially to focus our concern, other people in need for these first two readings. I think it's important, though, to do a little bit of a preface. A lot of people, when they read the work of Narveson and maybe even the work of Singer, they have this thing in the back of their mind that could get in the way of them understanding this. This is what's called, and if you're nerdy, you've come across this word and never known exactly what it came from. You come across this idea that is called the Malthusian dilemma, or it's by a person named Thomas Malthus. A new rendering of this Malthusian dilemma is by an author that's brilliant, but I disagree with him a lot, but he's absolute genius, is this guy Garrett Hardin. Garrett Hardin had an article called Lifeboat Ethics. So let me first present this as a tangent because I'm afraid this kind of idea is what's in your heads when you think about helping people who are starving, giving to charity and things like this. So let me tell this basic story. The story begins by imagining the population of the world in a series of lifeboats. Now, population has exploded and it keeps exploding, but let's freeze frame at about the time that Garrett Hardin wrote his article. At that time, the population of the Earth was roughly 6 billion. So, and let me try my little editing. So, imagine that the population of the world is represented where each of these little stick figures here represents 1 billion people. And we can put them in 3 lifeboats. And so what do you find? This is a good representation of what the Earth looked like when Garrett Hardin wrote his article. In 2 of the lifeboats is the bulk of the population of the Earth, right? So at the time, this would be 4 billion people, and they're in their lifeboats, and 2 billion people are in this other sort of lifeboat. In the nice lifeboat, which would include the American society, we have tons of resources. We get to decide what we'll eat based on our different diet. We have a bunch of different pairs of shoes to choose from. We are what Singer will call affluent, right? We don't spend the bulk of our day worrying about getting enough food or water. Then you have the bulk of the population of the Earth, 4 billion people at this time. Development has gotten better. At this time, 4 billion people on the planet, and their lifeboats don't have enough resources. They will spend the majority of their day just trying to get access to clean water and decent food. We can see the easy solution that a decent person would come up with. They would say, look, here are 2 billion people that have more resources than they really need, so they can just have a few less song downloads. They don't have to have so many sports cars or so many shoes. They can live a little more simply. It won't affect their happiness in the least, and they'll simply give some of their excess to the poorer countries. Good. So we take some of our resources off of our lifeboat and give it to the other 2 lifeboats. Now, here's the Malthusian problem, or what Garrett Hardin will talk about. The problem is that the populations double at a rate that's very different between the different kinds of countries. Most countries in the developed world, the fully developed countries, have a population doubling rate that is almost static, that isn't changing. In fact, if you look at a country like Germany, it's actually going down. Most German families have maybe 1 kid. If you're in France or Belgium or New Zealand or places like this, Japan, Korea, you don't have as many kids. Of course, Americans are different. They still have tons of kids, right? And we could talk about that cause. It'll come up later, so let's talk about it in a second. But what is the population doubling rate in the less developed countries, in the countries that lack for resources? Well, I think you know this. The population doubling rates are incredibly greater than those in the more developed countries. So it's almost ironic. It's tragic and terrible, but the countries that have the least resources have the biggest population explosions. So, what is Hardin trying to say? What was Thomas Malthus trying to say? If we look at it historically, sure, we can save 1 billion people's lives at least if we give some of our excess resources to charity. But look at what's happening. If we do that today, yes, we will save a lot of lives, nobody has to die. But if the population doubling rates keep going the same way they are, then what happens? Well, if we give and keep those people alive now, what's going to happen in just say 50 years when those population doubling rates, and notice this is exponential growth, what will happen? Well, now we will have to take a lot more of our resources to the point where we will really start to feel it. And what will happen? Instead of, here is the harsh conclusion, instead of allowing, say, 100 million people to die today if we don't give as much to charity, well, if we give the full amount to charity, what happens in 50 years? Now we're talking billions of people starving to death because now the resources of the developed countries will be at a loss as well. So, sounds awful, and I totally disagree, and I'll tell you why in a second. Malthus and Harding are saying the actual nice thing to do is let fewer people starve to death now than have an exponentially greater number of starving people later. Okay. Some of you are thinking about those sorts of issues when you're reading. That's why I bring this up. Now, what is the overall summary conclusion? Well, the actual conclusion is this isn't real about the facts. It isn't true that we will run out of these resources. Now, of course, one thing we could bank on that would get rid of all of these issues if we actually put a priority on making more food. The United States is an incredibly fertile land. We could feed the earth almost by ourselves. But what do we do instead, right? We don't grow food for people, we grow food for animals. Now, of course, what else can you do? And now this gets to be an interesting story. The other easy thing to do is, and notice the wording here, simply let these other countries develop. I know that sounded harsh, but it's true. A lot of the problems of lack of development in food production in the less developed world is because we take resources from those countries, so their food development is partly our fault. Narveson isn't saying we shouldn't give to charity because we're running out of food. He knows the facts, and that they are that we can produce as much food as we need and population doubling rates can go down. So he is going to use other reasons. So now let's turn to Narveson. Narveson, to give a background of his position, is what is called a U.S. libertarian, right? Now notice what I said. I said a U.S. libertarian because libertarianism in the United States and somewhat in places like the UK is a different brand of libertarianism than you find in other countries in the world. Let me explain. If you are in South America or Europe or East Asia and you say you're a libertarian, people will assume that you are the opposite of a U.S. libertarian. They will assume you're some kind of anarchist or socialist or communist, that you want people to do more to care for others, which is the opposite of a U.S. libertarian. So let's be careful. Again, don't confuse the notions. If I'm in Europe, I can say, yes, I'm libertarian, and they will say, oh, what kind of socialist or communist are you? Because that's the implications. In the United States, and here only, it means something completely different. It's a far right sort of social position. It means that we have a radical, pure sort of capitalism and that everyone needs to provide for themselves and we shouldn't look for help from the society, and especially we should not look for help from the government. The libertarian idea says that we all should have personal freedom, but also complete personal responsibility. If you are not doing well, the libertarian would say, that is your own fault. Don't ask for me or for the government or for society in general to help you. It is a fairly harsh and I think completely wrong-headed sort of notion, but we can talk about why. Now, if that offended you, please know, I agree with the negative criticisms that U.S. libertarians make about our society. I think we could be on the same stage about a lot of the issues that they find wrong with a society like ours. But it's when it comes to the conclusions that I couldn't disagree more with them. They think we need more capitalism, let corporations provide for us, and I think just the opposite. I think we should do more collectively. I think the people should organize themselves to meet the needs of one another, not be selfish douchebags. Sorry, that was overstated. Now, when I find someone like Narveson that I radically disagree with, I don't make the mistake of saying he's stupid, right? The idea is if you have a very smart person, and Jan Narveson is very brilliant, and so when you run into someone intelligent that you disagree with, don't make the normal mistake of saying they're dumb because I disagree with them. No. What you have to find is realize the only reason you disagree with them or you don't think they sound smart is because you're not understanding their assumptions, or another way to say it is you're not understanding that they're asking a different question than you are. So in this case, when we understand the assumptions that are behind what Narveson is saying, then we can see that is actually smart. If I agree with his assumptions, then his position makes sense. Now, of course, I completely disagree with his assumptions, but let's look at them, because I think some of you might agree, or at least partly agree with his assumptions, where I don't. All right, so let's look at the reading. I'm on page 1, the second to last paragraph of the Narveson reading. Here's what he says. The liberty proponent, now notice right there, he is using liberty in the sense of the libertarian proponent, right? There are other conceptions of freedom, but please note, he's trying to take that word and say, this applies to my view. The libertarian, or the liberty proponent, will thus insist that when Beethoven wrote symphonies instead of using his talents to grow food for the starving, like the peasants he depicted in his pastoral symphony, he was doing what he had a perfect right to do. Of course, we shouldn't coerce anybody to do what they don't want to do. People should be free to do what they want to do. Now, let's try. Let me look at an issue that'll help frame his assumption. Let's say that we are in class. I wish we were, I'm sorry, but let's pretend we are in class. Wouldn't it be nice that when Jeff starts to drone on too much about socialism or these crazy tangents of his, wouldn't it be good if we had some music playing in the background, right? Some people think that if you have music that's not too rhythmic, it actually helps people pay attention. Some studies show this. So, wouldn't it be nice? What if we could all just chip in, say, 50 cents, and we could pay for a copyright program so that we can play some music in the classroom when Jeff gets really awkward and loses track of where he is? Well, that sounds pretty good. And it's really cheap, because if we collectively pool our resources, man, it's 50 cents. Easy. What's the obvious problem, though? The problem is we have very different tastes in music. And notice, Narveson is talking about music, and so this is a good example. What would you guys want me to play if we had this collective music stream? Well, you guys would have what? Probably country, pop, trance music? I don't know. I would want to listen to 90s hip-hop, and you would say that's terrible, they're just talking, and we couldn't get along at all. Right? I would barf if I have to listen to your country music, and you would probably barf if you had to listen to my classic hip-hop stuff. So, what should we do? Well, the obvious libertarian solution is leave each other alone. Instead of sharing our resources, we should use them for however we see fit. Good. So let's listen to how he defends this. Last indent, page 1. So how do we settle this issue? If we were all connoisseurs, it would be easy. If you know and love great music, you will find it easy to believe that a symphony by Beethoven or Mahler is worth more than prolonging the lives of a few hundred starvelings for another few miserable years. If you're one of those starving persons, your view might well be different. Now, little aside, please don't call starving people starvelings to make it sound cute, right? That makes them sound like little songbirds or something. Please use better rhetoric, Narveson. But okay, point made. Here is what the Narveson assumption is. Second line, page 2. Here is the main assumption that makes libertarianism a rational solution if this is the truth. Here's what he says. Second line, page 2. There are all kinds of points of view, diverse and to a large extent incommensurable. That means they can't be unified. They can't cooperate, right? They can't be combined. Uniting them is not as simple as the welfarist. He would call me the welfarist. I want our resources to be used for the collective well-being of society. Sorry, now let's continue. Uniting them is not as simple as the welfarist, Jeff, or utilitarian. He's talking about Singer here. So the author that you just read alongside this, that's who he's poking at here. He says it's not as simple as Jeff or Singer may think. It is not certain, not obvious that we, quote, add more to the sum of human happiness, that is what Singer would say, by supporting the opera than by supporting Oxfam. Now notice, Oxfam is a World Hunger Organization that Singer directly supports. I think he has something like 20% of his paycheck go automatically to Oxfam. He is a decent guy. How are we to unite diverse people on these evaluative matters? The most plausible answer, I think, is the point of view that allows different people to live their various lives by forbidding interference with the lives of others. Now you get it. If it is true that we cannot unify our values, then of course the only solution is let everybody make their own choices, decide how they want to use their resources by themselves. But that is where I disagree almost completely. I think it is true that we're very diverse in our tastes, but we're not that diverse in our values. Sure, we might have different beliefs. For example, if an American sees someone in India starving and you look and see that there are cows walking all around, you would say, wow, they have radically different values than I do. I would be eating that cow instead of starving. And you would say, oh, they're crazy because they value cows as much as people. Well, notice, their values aren't different. It's just their beliefs that are different. The culture's different. Would you, if you're hungry, eat your grandparents? No, of course you wouldn't. That's terrible. Well, if you have the belief in reincarnation or transmigration of souls like in Hinduism, then you believe the cow could in fact be your reincarnated grandmother. So you are not going to eat the cow just like you wouldn't eat your grandmother. So is the value different? No. Neither of us thinks we should be eating our relatives, and it's just that the Hindu thinks that could be the case when it comes to eating cows, so we don't eat cows. An easy way to defeat this assumption is just to point to values like the one of not eating your relatives that we all share. Now that one seemed a little far-fetched, but take very basic things. For example, Narveson in his article will talk about how we don't know how to help people of a foreign culture and diet. That is what he says. Now, yes, we might look at people's diets and say they're pretty different, but is it really that hard to find unifying things that we all care about? No. In fact, right over here, I have a special formula. I have something very special I brought with me that every diet agrees to. It is so nutritious, in fact, that it by itself would prevent many, many deaths in the world. In fact, the vast majority of deaths in the less developed countries could be prevented with this chemical formula I have right over here. Let me go get it. Here it is. What is the special chemical formula that would prevent a lot of the deaths due to starvation in the world? Yes, you guessed it, water. We all have a universal care for clean drinking water. We could all unify around that value. Now notice, right now I am teaching this while the coronavirus pandemic is involved. Do we see that a lot of us have the same values? We all need basic quality health care. We all need to breathe. Got it. We could talk about other needs for basic health care, of course. Let me say something about the economics of this really briefly. There are versions of libertarianism that are moderate, and they do make sense. A full-born libertarian would not last for very long as a society. The only person that could be a libertarian and actually live that way would be someone that's independently wealthy. They could provide for their own needs. That's very few people on the whole planet. Good? So, what do you find? Economically, it is insane to think that anybody could live all on their own, that they could live without the collective benefits that societies and governments provide. For example, I have a dad, right? He is now dying, so he doesn't say this anymore, but he always said that nobody helped me, I shouldn't have to help anyone, and so he would always vote for low taxes, cuts in welfare, and things like this. Now, of course, as I grew up, I started to seeing what goes on, and I said, but wait a second, Dad. You did not create all your wealth by yourself. Where did you go to school? You went to school at places, and by the way, they are almost all like this. In fact, Liberty University is the only school that doesn't collect public grants and public subsidies and tax dollars to provide education. So, Dad, when you went through your K through 12 education, when you went to San Diego State, and then when you went to Stanford, you didn't pay for those yourself. The tuition only covers a tiny portion. At C&M, your tuition covers a tiny portion of your education. My salary is paid by property taxes. All the other people in the state provide for this school. I would also ask my dad, so Dad, your employees, right, that work for you, did you educate them all yourself, or did they use public dollars to educate themselves? How do you get water? What are the roads you take to get to work? Did you pave all those, or did we collectively pay for those things? Exactly. We all rely on the labor of tons of people just to live our daily lives. So here's the idea. There are plenty of things that work just fine in capitalism, but there are other things that we need to pay for collectively, such as roads. Let's use another example. Did you know, wait, think of this. Why do we call roads, some of our bigger roads, freeways? Well, it's because they didn't used to be free. Why do they call it a turnpike? Because there used to be a pike, right? A barrier that was in the way. And to get on the road, you had to pay the toll, and then they would turn the pike for you so you could get onto the roadway. What did we realize? Well, everybody needs roads, and we need them everywhere, so let's just pay for them collectively. Another example, firefighting. This is amazing. Did you know that not too long ago in this country, firefighting was not a public enterprise? It was private. What they would do is you had to pay money to the local fire station, and if you didn't pay your dues, they wouldn't fight fire at your house. You had to have a little emblem on your door, and if your house was on fire, the fire truck would show up and look to see if you had the emblem, and if you didn't, they would drive right by. Now, is that a good way to fight fire? Only fighting the fire at the houses who have paid their dues? No, that's ridiculous. Fire spread like pandemic spread, and so this is what public money should go for. The best way to provide for it is collectively. If we pay for roads collectively, they don't cost us very much. If I needed to pay for just the road that goes the 1 mile it takes me to get to the C&M campus, I couldn't afford it probably in my whole lifetime, but collectively it's very cheap. So that's a pretty good rule. When does libertarianism fail, and when do you need a more socialist style of economy? Whenever the good or service is something that everybody needs, they can't predict when and where they'll need it, and so it's much cheaper to pay for it collectively. This works for plumbing under our city streets, roads, firefighting. I think it's best to pay for education this way, and if you're not learning this by the pandemic by now, healthcare is much better to pay for this way. So first, I just went through a long tangent on why this is economically a terrible idea. Now I want you to see it from a moral perspective. So as a moral position, how does this stack up? Let's look. So we can ask this first question. When are we obligated to help one another? So when, now be careful with those words. When we say an action is obligated, it means two things. It means that it must be done, and it also means that you're a bad person if you don't fulfill that obligation. You could even talk about that person should be trusted, that person should even be punished. But the idea is, if it's an obligation, you must do it or you're a bad person. When we talk about recommendations in a second, notice it's a different language there. So if we say something like should and we mean recommendation, what does that mean? It means you are good if you do it, but you're not bad if you don't. It is something a good person would do, but we can't hold you responsible for not doing it. We can't force people to be good people. But notice an obligation is different. An obligation is something that any healthy person would do, and we can expect them to do it. So, according to Narveson, when are we obligated to help one another? Here's what he says. Enforced feeding of the starving, however, does cross the line. Invading the farmer or the merchant, forcing him to part with some of his hard-earned produce and give it without compensation to others. By the way, he's talking about taxes right there, not necessarily directly giving food. He's objecting to taxes that are used to help others. That, says the advocate of liberty, in short, the U.S. libertarian, that, says the libertarian, is theft, not charity. So if someone is starving, we may pity him or we may be indifferent. But the question, so far as our obligations are concerned, is this: how did he get that way? If it was not the result of my previous activities, then I have no obligation to him and may help him out or not as I choose. If it was a result of my own doing, then of course I must do something. So, notice, there is only one, absolutely one case in when Narveson thinks we should be obligated to help others. That is only when we cause them to be in need directly. Now, of course, I had a student a couple semesters ago that said, but Jeff, right, if we look at, like you said earlier, and he studied these issues, if I look at people that are starving in our society or around the world, we do find that we, as Americans, are often responsible. We often exploit those countries and take their resources. So in a way, Narveson should have to be consistent and say, any country we exploited, we owe them. So beyond an obligation, when would Narveson say that it is recommended? When would he say you should, to be a good person, help someone? Now listen, because he uses some language that fools many of us, because we're used to hearing people talk this way. But we don't realize what we're actually saying when we say these sorts of words. So many of you in your opinion papers would imply these sorts of things, right? I should only help people if I feel like it, right? I'll know it when I see it. I should never be forced to. Now notice, that sounds reasonable, but let's fill it in. So, let's start on page 2, right in the middle of the page, the indent on the middle of page 2. The anti-welfarist idea. So he's saying, the idea that we should never help one another, that's by anti-welfarist. The idea that we should never help others, however, can be taken too far. Should people be disposed to assist each other in time of need? Certainly they should. But the appropriate rule for this is not that each person is duty-bound to minister to the poor until he himself is a pauper, a totally poor person, or near pauper as well. Rather, the appropriate rule is what the characterization in time of need more nearly suggests. There are indeed emergencies in life when a modest effort by someone will do a great deal for someone else. People who aren't ready to help others when it is comparatively easy to do so are people who deserve to be avoided when they themselves turn to others in time of need. But this all assumes that these occasions are, in the first place, relatively unusual, and in the second, that the help offered is genuinely of modest cost to the provider. So let's keep track of this. So we are only obligated if we cause them to be at need, but when should we go out of our way, even when it's not obligated, and help people? Well, he has his first two conditions. The first condition is only when it's rare, and the second condition is only when it's easy for us to help. It's a rare occasion. It doesn't happen all the time. Now let's keep going. Let's see if there are more conditions. Last paragraph of page 2. What about parting with the means for making your sweet little daughter's birthday party a memorable one, in order to keep a dozen strangers alive on the other side of the world? Now notice, a little exaggeration in the rhetoric, right? I don't think that's your real dilemma. Should I give my daughter a party or send all this money to the other side of the world? I'm sure you can hedge your bets. But let's listen. Is this something you are morally required to do? It is not. She may well matter to you more than they, and well she should. This illustrates again the point that people do not count equally for most of us. Normal people care more about some people than others. It is reasonable then to arrive at a general understanding that we shall be ready to help when help is urgent and when giving it is not very onerous to us. So notice, again, we're close to the other condition, right? Rare occasions, the help is easy, and notice he added a third, when it's someone that you care about. Let's let him defend this a little further. Let's go to about the 7th line of the second paragraph on page 3. This is what amounts to a consideration of efficiency. We know ourselves and our loved ones. We do not know by definition strangers. We can choose a gift for someone we know and love, but are we wise to try to benefit someone, and now he says it, of alien culture and diet? If we do a good thing for someone we know well, we make an investment that will be returned as the years go by. Now it's sounding a little fishy. But we have little idea of the payoff from charity for the unknown. So pause there. He has now added this condition that says we should focus our charity only on people we know well, because we aren't efficient at giving to other people. So it should be people we naturally care about and we know their needs very well. That's a lot of conditions now. Keep reading, right where we left off. The tendency and desire to do good for others is a virtue. Moreover, it is a moral virtue, for we all have an interest in the general acquisition of this quality. Right, now he's giving us some nice little words saying we should all want to be good people. Just as anyone can kill anyone else, okay, that was a weird turn right there, so anyone can benefit anyone else. I really think that's sort of a black and white fallacy. I think there are plenty of options between killing people and helping them, but let's see. And so long as the cost to oneself of participating in the general scheme of helpfulness is low, notice, namely decidedly less than the return, then it is likely to be worth it, but it is not reasonable to take the matter beyond that. We have a fifth condition that is really crazy, right? This is extreme. He is saying it is not reasonable to help other people unless you get more than you give. Now, of course, he doesn't just mean money. He could mean happiness or something like this. But he is saying it is only reasonable to help others if you profit. It has to be worth it for you. That sounds very capitalist and scary to me. Capitalism has its place, but I don't think charity should be run on a capitalist scheme. All right. So let's look at this. So we have a bunch of different conditions. The conditions of when we should go out of our way and try to be good people is when it's rare, when it's easy, it's someone you knew well, it doesn't happen all the time, it's someone you naturally care about and you benefit. All right. Well, let's apply it to a couple different scenarios. Let's apply it first to one that he kind of brings up without meaning to. He says, right, the second to last paragraph of the whole piece, he says this, right, just to make it clear. He blames countries. In fact, all of the substantial starvation, as opposed to the occasional flood, in the middle to later parts of the 20th century has been due to politics, not agriculture. Now remember what I said about Hardin and Thomas Malthus. Narveson is saying it's not agriculture. It's not that we can't produce enough food. Notice, he is saying it is governments. It is how we distribute food that is to blame. Well, let's see. Let's apply his view to governments. So let's take a case like Ethiopia. Let's pretend that you are the political leader of Ethiopia and you have some money, right? Leaders of these countries do tend to be wealthy, right? So let's talk. So let's first to see if what Narveson would recommend these countries do if he's blaming them for the starvation in the world. By the way, he is right. It is the allocation of resources. But let's see what he would advise them to do. So let's see. You're the leader of Ethiopia. Are you obligated to give this wealth to the people in need in your society? Well, of course you're not obligated. They were starving before you got there. It's not your fault they're starving, so no obligation whatsoever. So you're not a bad person for not giving. Well, now let's see if he would recommend that the leader of Ethiopia give their extra money to the people in the society. Well, let's apply his conditions, right? Is this a rare occasion? No. They've been hungry for a while, and there'll probably be a lot of hungry people for years. So it's not a rare occasion. Will this be easy for me? Well, that depends on me. What if I really want to buy some tanks and some cars or buy some weapons from the United States instead of giving food to the starving? Well, then that's not easy. That's a lot of money. Is it someone that I naturally care about? No, I don't know those people at all. I'm only friends with rich people. Is it someone that I know well? Nope, I don't know them very well. They live a very different life than I do. Finally, right, will this benefit me? No. I will get way more benefit from buying more tanks or ammo, buying a better car for me. I think I need a swimming pool. I think I need a ski resort. Good? In Ethiopia. By the way, if you've seen the ski resorts in places like the United Arab Emirates, that's wealth. So, what would Narveson recommend? The very thing that he is blaming them for, right? His view would amount to leaders of starving countries not helping. He would even disrecommend them helping because it won't benefit them. Wow. Let's try another case. Let's borrow from Signer. So here you are. You are sitting in your classroom, and let's say you're waiting for Jeff to show up. Now, of course, I know you're always sad that I am always there. I never miss class, right? And I'm there early. But let's say you're sitting in class and I haven't arrived yet. And you're starting to talk to one another because you look at the clock, class should have started. This is weird, right? We finally get a day off from that nerd. Then someone notices out the window, they see Jeff running toward the classroom. Hey, you guys, look. And right then you all look out the window and you see me rushing, right? I have all my books in my hand. I'm rushing to class. And right as you look, let's say that the little pond in front of our campus, it's sometimes filled with water, but let's say there's this little pond, and as you're running, there's a little girl running right near me, and she trips, hits her head, and falls face down in the water as you're watching. So the whole class is watching me out the window, and you see me running, and right in front of me, a little child trips and falls face down in a pond. Well, now let's imagine what I do. So you're looking out the window. I am rushing to class, I'm carrying my notebooks, there I am, and I see the girl fall. I pause for a second. What do? I look at how nice my shoes are. These are my favorite kicks. I look at my watch and realize I'm late. And so what do? I keep right on going to class and forget about the little girl. Now, please talk to the screen. Tell me what you think about me if you see me do that. What would you think of me if I put my concern about being late and worrying about damaging my shoes ahead of the life of this child? Now, of course, you would probably use a bunch of cuss words. That's great, absolutely. But notice you would also say something more clinical. You would say, there's something wrong with him. And yes, I could be diagnosed with something like sociopathy just by that occasion. And if you talked to me and I said, oh, I didn't want to be late to class and I didn't want to ruin my shoes, you would say, yes, you have a mental health problem. Now, let's go back to Narveson's advice. Let's see what he would say about the child in the pond. First, am I obligated to help her? Like you seem to think I would be. You seem to think that I'm a terrible person if I don't help. What does Narveson say? No. Obviously, I didn't push her in, so it's not my fault. I have no obligation to her at all. Then would he even say it's good? Well, that depends. It depends on what I consider a burden to be, right? Do I think that's an easy help? Well, I really like these shoes and I'm late to class. It also depends on, do I naturally care about that child? Don't know her. I don't naturally care about children. I really like kids. But what if I just don't like kids? And do I know her? Don't know her. Will I benefit? No, most likely I won't benefit, right? So it's not even clear that Narveson would even recommend me help. He might even say it's unreasonable. I'm taking things too far. Damn. So this is what I am saying. This view morally amounts to recommending people be sociopaths, because only a sociopath would act that way. All right, so let's look at Singer. Now, Singer is actually a really famous person. He is one of these philosophers that's crossed over to be a well-known figure. He is often voted as one of the most important intellectuals in the world. It is a basic moral or even scientific idea that you should have multiple reasons for a view. So, for example, and please don't be offended by this, if the only defense of a position you hold is that your mom said it, if the only reason for your position is that it feels good to you, or let's be more offensive, if the only reason for your position is because God said it or the Bible said it, but you can't justify it any other ways. If you can't justify it scientifically, morally, economically, right, psychologically, if you can't justify what you're doing in multiple ways, then be very careful in how confident you are in promoting that value. So, let me give you multiple different reasons for why you should eat less meat. And what's fun is if I went around the room and talked to the people who eat very little meat, right, they would give a very different list. Now you would think, doesn't that point to inconsistency? No. I would probably agree to most things in their list. I would just have a different ordering of those things. What does this mean? There are multiple good reasons for eating less meat. We are not just focused on one good reason. Let me give my list just for the fun of it, and you should be thinking about what your lists are, and of course try to counteract every item on my list if you want to defend eating as much meat as most people do. Here's my list. One comes directly from Singer. I found Singer's work to be very compelling, so I changed my mind about meat eating. For this, the major reason for me is to save resources, reduce climate change, use less water, use less fossil fuels. The best way to do those things, eat less meat. I want to save more resources for other people, so that's my main reason. The second reason is health. A plant-based diet is healthier than a meat-based diet. My third reason is concern for animals. Now notice, for some of you, that would be your first reason, and good for you. The way I think about it is this when I talk to people. When you talk to your older relatives who are racist, you find them incredibly embarrassing, right? I had a grandpa that was pretty racist, and it was just embarrassing, right? I would make sure not to bring up anything like race around him because he would just make a fool of himself saying stupid stuff. Well, that is a generational problem. I think the animal rights issue is going to be a generational problem too. I think these recent generations are starting to rethink how we treat animals. And I think when your grandkids look at you and you say, oh, meat's tasty, that's why I eat it, I think they're going to be embarrassed of you. I think they're going to look at you like I looked at my grandpa that was so racist. Anyway, my fourth reason is to reduce pollution and pathogens. Is this timely? Right now, we're on a shutdown because of coronavirus. What is very likely the trigger here? Meat-eating animal pathogens. Second reason, tastiness. I find most meat food very uncareful, very simple in the way it's prepared. You throw some cheese on it, throw some chili on it. You're not even really tasting the meat. So I found most vegetarian food to be better than meat-based food. Fourth reason, I want to support farmers. I want farmers to feel good about what they're doing because they're feeding, not just making breakfast cereals out of corn, but actually growing things that feed people directly. Farmers would way rather produce our food than just feed for livestock. Okay. All right. Okay, Jeff, calm down. Sorry. So now let's talk about Singer's position on when we are obligated and when we are recommended to help other people. I think when you understand Singer's view, you will find it to be completely intuitive and have a hard time disagreeing with it. Now, please note, this view is not a utilitarian view. He is stating a very general sort of principle that doesn't amount to the very radical position of utilitarianism. This is just a basic common sense sort of principle. So let's find the principle first. The last indent on page 1 says this. So, considering the case of the pond, right? Should we save that little child in the pond? Singer says, obviously, we all think we should save the child in the pond, but let's see why. A plausible principle that would support the judgment that I ought to pull the child out is this. If it is in our power to prevent something very bad from happening, without thereby sacrificing anything of comparable moral significance, we ought to do it. What I do with this basic principle is flush it out into a whole set of advice. Okay, so let me try to draw. I know you're missing my drawings. You wish you were in class so you could see my wonderful cave drawing. You can see George the Carpenter. I know you missed that stuff. So here we go. What do you think this is? Obviously, I am so good at art. Obviously, it's a scale. So make sure to label the scale. Now notice, please, first, I use a scale and not just something that measures weight, because a scale gives you a comparison of weights. And this is a scale of comparative moral worth. So this does not weigh how heavy something is. It doesn't weigh how expensive it is. It weighs how morally important it is. So here's what you can do. You take the situation like the pond story. And on one side of the scale, you put, what does the victim have to lose if you don't help? So, what do we have in this case? A child's life. That's pretty heavy, morally. What do we have on this side? On this side, you put what you lose if you help. Now, what do I lose if I don't help the child in the pond? I ruin some shoes and I'm late to class. What would we say? Compared to a child's life, that weighs almost nothing by comparison. And so what do you see? When the moral worth of the comparison is completely incomparable, there is no comparison. Look at the scale, right? It is bottoming out compared to the value of my shoes. When we look at the value of a child's life, In such a case, when there is no comparison, it's ridiculous to compare the two worths, then you are obligated. But notice, if you take another case, when the worth, the moral worth of what they have to lose if you don't help versus what you sacrifice if you help, if they are comparable, now we can talk about a recommendation. So let's say there is a burning building, right? Let's say I look out my window and I see a burning building. Now, if it is very dangerous, right, and I risk merely my life, but very much my health and safety, to rush in there and save a child, we would say, well, if the risk is comparable to what that child has to risk, then it is recommended that you help, but not an obligation. Then we can now understand, for the first time for most people, what we mean when we talk about a hero. So are there plenty of cases where a soldier or a firefighter or a policeman does risk their life to save the life of someone else? Yes. Those losses are equivalent, not just comparable. They are risking an equivalent value. Then we can talk about heroes. So finally, we have a way of referring to heroes that actually makes sense. I think that when you look at this thing, if I explained it clearly, I think it's hard to disagree with. I think most of you would use Singer to back up your actual intuitions about when we should help others. Thanks.